Warp Tour, one of the most important episodes of Steven Universe's first season. And if you did follow my previous review to this one, then you do know that I do consider the previous review, Lion 3 Straight to Video, to be the quote-unquote launch of Steven Universe 2.0, which makes this technically the first regular episode of that Steven Universe 2.0, where they refocus the show on more plot-relevant episodes with a more definitive, overreaching plot for the series, that being the return of Homeworld gems to Earth. Now, we've definitely gotten little hints at things like this at other points in the series. We had the gems visit the Galaxy Warp in Space Race and talk about how that would be the way that gems would get to and from Earth from other planets. And we actually do revisit the Galaxy Warp in this episode very, very briefly, because, spoilers ahead, of course, this episode is all about, as I mentioned before, Homeworld gems coming back to Earth. This is the first time that a Homeworld gem comes back to Earth. And quite frankly, I would have expected the Crystal Gems to have been expecting this, because Lapis went back home, unless they just didn't know Lapis's full capabilities and didn't realize that she would be able to make it back there as quickly as she did. Now, I don't think that this particular event in this particular episode was in any way triggered by her arriving back home. I think that some events later on were at least partially triggered by that, but I don't think Lapis is there yet. I don't think she has reached Homeworld yet at this point. All of that said, let's get into the episode proper. This episode begins with the end of the world. Pearl and Amethyst are getting along. All jokes aside, they're actually really cute in the scene, and I think this is where most people start shipping them. I'm not really sure, because I don't really, but I could definitely see why people would after this scene. They're just very cute together, and they're very cute playing off of each other. But more importantly, Steven has allergies. They are apparently on their way back from having defeated some sort of gem creature, some sort of corrupted gem, and the plant life in the area has been triggering Steven's allergies. So he's having trouble seeing, his eyes are all watery and squinty, and he's sneezing. And this is important because there's not only a little bit of comedy here between him and Pearl, but once they enter the warp stream to go back, and this is, I believe, the first time we get a good look at the warp streams, and it's definitely the first time we get a good look at what I call the warp space in just a moment, because he sneezes in the warp stream and the Force blows his head outside of the warp, and we get to see the space outside of the warp for the first time. And I've already talked about the warp space itself specifically, so I'm not going to talk about it here, but it is important to note that this is where Steven comes in contact with the plot device for this episode. He sees another active warp stream with something in it, and it looks vaguely spheroid at this point, but that could just be a simplification due to the warp stream affecting it. We don't really know exactly what it looks like at this point, but it is something, and it is something using the warp that is not part of their group. And there's a couple issues I have with where the plot goes at this point. We already know that warp whistles exist, and we can infer that they were used during the war to allow Rose's human allies, which we do know existed, to travel via the warps when there weren't any gems present. So why do none of them consider that maybe some human out there found a warp whistle? They're also very, very sure at this point that there are no other gems on Earth. At least no other gems who can use the warps, which I'm assuming corrupted gems can't use the warps, which allows us to infer that whatever happened to cause all the rest of the gems who were on Earth back during the war to either die or corrupt or whatever happened to them was pretty final. In that after it occurred, it was pretty obvious to those who survived that there weren't any conscious gems left, that the only gems who remained were the corrupted gems. But we're getting way ahead of ourselves here. The point is, this is one of the best scenes in the entire episode because we can infer so much from the dialogue that happens here. However, there is one issue that I have with this dialogue and with this episode in particular, which I will get to at the end of this review. For the time being, they get back to the temple, Steven goes to turn in for the night, and Amethyst is a complete dick. She gets him all worked up about the thing that he saw, he gets scared, and he is now unable to sleep. And the following morning, he continues to insist that he saw this thing, even though the other crystal gems swear up and down that there couldn't be anything else using the warps. So we get a few scenes here now of them taking the warps to various locations that we have seen before, and checking to see if there's anything at any of them that could be using the warps. And it kind of feels like they're just humoring Steven, and then once they arrive at the Galaxy Warp, it becomes obvious that they actually are. Because Pearl gets all up in Steven's face and is a complete dick, and basically forces him to admit that they must be right and that he must be wrong. And then they start talking about him like he's not even there. Everybody's a dick in this episode. This could just be called Everybody's a Dick, the episode. Because even Steven goes off on them now, snapping at them for treating him like he's not there, which is valid, but the kid hasn't slept now in a couple days. There's a tad bit of a chance here that he's overreacting just slightly. Point being, they now return back to the temple again, and once again Steven is unable to sleep, so when a small, round, green, marble-like robot smashes through the roof of his house, he is just ecstatic. He has been vindicated, and he laughs this crazy laugh because it's been so long since he's slept, he doesn't even know how to react at this point. And he and the robot struggle very, very briefly, and he damages not only the robot, but the warp itself. And this is when we see something pretty freaking scary. The robot repairs the warp in his house, and then uses the warp to transport to the galaxy warp, which means, I guess, only certain warp pads are actually connected to the galaxy warp, which is weird, I don't know. Otherwise, it could have just warped there earlier when it was in the stream earlier, right? That makes sense? I don't know. It's not important. What is important is it's not the only one either. When Steven follows it into the warp, there's a whole bunch of them. They gang up on him and push him out of the warp, where it's so cold that he's about to die. Whoops. He even says it. He even flat out says, "I'm going to die." Anyway, Garnet manages to save him. She reaches just far enough out of the warp stream to grab him and pull him back into the warp. And she actually cries when she realizes, when she sees one of the robots there in the stream, he's been holding on to it, when she sees the robot there with him in the stream and realizes how wrong she was, she actually cries a tear because she realizes that she took her own problems out on him. And again, I'll get to that in a moment. And then the other gems show up. You find out that Garnet realized that he was outside of the stream, and they subsequently followed him into the stream to save him. And so they continue to follow the stream, and they end up at the galaxy warp, and the robots have all come together, and they repair the galaxy warp. Now it is entirely possible for gems to either leave Earth, or for gems to come from Homeworld to Earth. That has been the purpose of these robots all along. And immediately afterwards, a gem arrives on Earth. It's Peridot. We learn her name here, but we also learn some other very interesting things. First of all, she's kind of cold and very purposeful in her actions. And the other crystal gems don't recognize her, which, based on what we learn later regarding gem type and how all gems of the same type are basically treated as the same entity in gem society, it can be inferred from this that they don't recognize her gem type either, which means that Peridots were actually minted after the war ended. And we get, I don't know if there's a word for it, but there's this trope in television and movies, but television specifically because of the episodic format, where a character will about to give some very important exposition and then some seemingly random event prevents them from getting it out. Peridot here starts to talk about how she's here to reactivate the kindergarten for something. At this point, we haven't seen the kindergarten yet, and we don't know what that something could be, but we hear just enough before she is interrupted by one of her little robots to pique our interest and get us wondering what this could be. It's very well done, and I absolutely like it. It's probably the other best scene in this episode. There's quite a few of them, in fact. But anyway, we do see that she realizes from the damage to the robot that Steven beat the crap out of, and the fact that he has left stickers on all the warps at the galaxy warp, that someone has been here, that someone is on Earth with the capability to reach the galaxy warp. And this is something that she didn't even know was possible, so she gets the heck out of there. She leaves behind a little EMP device that deactivates all of her robots, and then Garnet comes up, she super grows her gauntlets and smashes the galaxy warp into little pieces with very little chance of it ever being put back together. And she claims that the problem is solved, that this is over. Of course it's not. And that brings me to the issue I have with this episode, and that is the fact that Pearl and Garnet are very clearly in denial here. You could argue that Amethyst is as well, but she never personally witnessed the might of Homeworld. Garnet and Pearl did. I already mentioned that early in this episode implies very heavily that whatever happened that left them the only living gems on the planet was definitive enough that there is no doubt in their minds that they are the only living gems left on the planet who aren't corrupted gems. If that doesn't ingrain the might of your enemy into your brain, I don't know what will. So even though we haven't learned it yet, even though we haven't been specifically told it yet, we can already infer at this point that Garnet can see the future, and we later learn that that is true. She must have at some point seen that there were possible futures that included something like this happening. In fact, the only way to explain how she knew that Steven was outside of the warp stream was for her to foresee it with her future vision. Which means that she was so negatively impacted by the war with Homeworld that she is now denying the possibility, even though she knows for a fact that the possibility exists, of their return. And it explains everything here. It explains why she's so unwilling to listen to Steven. It explains why she's so dismissive of Steven. And it explains why she is so dismissive of the problem after simply destroying one method of arrival. She knows that Homeworld has intergalactic starships, and yet she destroys the galaxy warp and then proclaims the problem solved. And Pearl is no more willing to pursue this issue than Garnet is, because I think she was even more damaged by the experience, especially considering the way she reacts after Peridot leaves. She is so frightened that she's hysterical. The Crystal Gems may be the self-proclaimed guardians of Earth, but they're not really in any condition to be guarding anything. And again, I'm not going to delve too much into this and what this means for their psychological state, because I do plan on doing an analysis video of it at some point, but let's just say it's pretty obvious to me that these two have some pretty serious cases of PTSD, and that they're not doing a super good job of coping with it, which I wouldn't expect them to. Humans with fleshy, aging minds that forget things can't cope with PTSD. A Crystal Gem with a perfect eternal mind wouldn't be able to cope with it any better than we can. I just find it a very interesting portrayal of them, that they are so damaged that without even meaning to, without even wanting to, they put themselves and the people who they have sworn to protect at risk. All of that said, though, I do still think there's some muddledness to this episode, if that makes any sense. While I think the reactions of the Gems to the kinds of things that Steven is saying, to the kind of things that he's suggesting, is justifiable with their obvious denial of the situation, I think the writers and the animators take it a little too far. The Gems have been shown to come to trust Steven at this point. I can't see them being this outright dismissive and flat out rude to him. They're rude. They're mean to Steven in this episode. It seems out of character enough that I wonder if the writing could have been handled a little better. I still don't think it's bad. Don't get me wrong. I still understand why they behaved this way. I guess I would have handled it a little differently personally. There's also the fact that we have seen the warp whistle at this point, as I mentioned before, and I do think that someone somewhere in this episode probably should have considered the possibility that some human somewhere had gotten their hands on a warp whistle. And to be perfectly honest, that seems pretty dangerous in and of itself. They talk about at other points in the series, mostly later on, about how dangerous it would be for humans to get their hands on gem technology they don't understand. In fact, we saw evidence of this, of how dangerous this is, in the episode Onion Trade. So are you telling me that that wasn't even a possibility at all? Because I just don't see that being true. That said, even with the minor writing kerfuffles that I've mentioned, this episode is still a must-see. It's one of the best episodes of the series in terms of lore, and it's one of the most important episodes of the series in terms of understanding this new developing plot point of Homeworld returning to Earth. And we get to meet Peridot. I'm very excited about that. I love Peridot. So as far as I'm concerned, any excuse to get Peridot into an episode is a perfectly valid excuse. But guys, what did you think of this episode? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. Either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.